Just after my grandfather's death, it seemed to be a time of extraordinary dullness in religion. Licentiousness for some years prevailed among the youth of the town. They were, many of them, very much addicted to night walking, and by frequenting the tavern and lewd practices, wherein some by their example exceedingly corrupted others. It was their manner very frequently to get together in conventions of both sexes for mirth and jollity, which they called frolics, and they would often spend a greater part of the night in them, without any regard to any order in the families they belonged to, and indeed family government did too much fail in the town. It was become very customary with many of our young people to be indecent in their carriage at meeting, which doubtless would not have prevailed in such a degree had it not been that my grandfather, through his great age, though he retained his powers surprisingly to the last, was not so able to observe them. There had also long prevailed in the town a spirit of contention between two parties, into which they had for many years been divided, by which they maintained a jealousy one of the other, and were prepared to oppose one another in all public affairs. But in 2 or 3 years after Mr. Stoddart's death, there began to be a sensible amendment of these evils. The young people showed more of a disposition to hearken to counsel, and by degrees left off their frolics, and grew observably more decent in their attendance on the public worship, and there were more who manifested a religious concern than there used to be. At the latter end of the year 1733, there appeared a very unusual flexibleness and yielding to advice in our young people. It had been too long their manner to make the evening after the Sabbath and after public lecture to be especially the times of their mirth and company keeping. But a sermon was now preached on the Sabbath before the lecture to show the evil tendency of the practice and to persuade them to reform it. And it was urged on heads of families that it should be a thing agreed upon among them to govern their families and keep their children at home at these times. It was also more privately moved that they should meet together the next day in their several neighborhoods to know each other's minds, which was accordingly done, and the notion complied with throughout the town. But parents found little or no occasion for the exercise of government in the case. The young people declared themselves convinced by what they had heard from the pulpit, and were willing of themselves to comply with the counsel that had been given, and it was immediately, and I suppose almost universally, complied with, and there was a thorough reformation of these disorders thenceforward, which was continued over since. Presently after this, there began to appear a remarkable religious concern at a little village belonging to the congregation called Pascumac, where a few families were settled, at about 3 miles distance from the main body of the town. At this place, a number of persons seemed to be savingly wrought upon. In the April following anno 1734, there happened a very sudden and awful death of a young man in the bloom of his youth, who being violently seized with pleurisy, and taken immediately very delirious, died in about 2 days, which together with what was preached publicly on that occasion, much affected many young people. This was followed with another death of a young married woman, who had been considerably exercised in mind about the salvation of her soul before she was ill, and was in great distress in the beginning of her illness, but seemed to have satisfying evidence of God's mercy to her before her death, so that she died very full of comfort, in a most earnest and moving manner, warning and counseling others. This seemed to contribute to render solemn the spirits of many young persons, and there began evidently to appear more of a religious concern on people's minds. In the fall of the year, I proposed it to the young people that they should agree among themselves to spend the evenings after lectures in social religion, and to that end divide themselves into several companies to meet in various parts of the town, which was accordingly done, and those meetings have been since continued, and the example imitated by elder people. This was followed with the death of an elderly person, which was attended with many unusual circumstances, by which many were much moved and affected. About this time began the great noise in this part of the country about Arminianism, which seemed to appear with a very threatening aspect upon the interest of religion here. The friends of vital piety trembled for fear of the issue, but it seemed contrary to their fear strongly to be overruled for the promoting of religion. Many who looked on themselves as in a Christless condition seemed to be awakened by it, with fear that God was about to withdraw from the land, and that we should be given up to heterodoxy and corrupt principles, and that then their opportunity for obtaining salvation would be past. Many who were brought a little to doubt about the truth of the doctrines they had hitherto been taught seemed to have a kind of trembling fear with their doubts, lest they should be led into bypass to their eternal undoing. and they seemed with much concern and engagedness of mind to inquire what was indeed the way in which they must come to be accepted with God. There were some things said publicly on that occasion concerning justification by faith alone, although great fault was found with meddling with the controversy in the pulpit by such a person and at that time, and though it was ridiculed by many elsewhere, yet it proved a word spoken in season here, and was most evidently attended with a very remarkable blessing of heaven to the souls of the people in this town. They received thence a general satisfaction with respect to the main thing in question, which they had been in trembling doubts and concern about, and their minds were engaged the more earnestly to seek that they might come to be accepted of God, and saved in the way of the gospel, which had been made evident to them to be the true and only way. And then it was in the latter part of December that the Spirit of God began extraordinarily to set in, and wonderfully to work amongst us. And there were very suddenly, one after another, 5 or 6 persons who were to all appearances savingly converted, and some of them wrought upon in a very remarkable manner. Particularly, I was surprised with the relation of a young woman who had been one of the greatest company keepers in the whole town. When she came to me, I had never heard that she was become in any wise serious, but by the conversation I then had with her, it appeared to me that what she gave an account of was a glorious work of God's infinite power and sovereign grace, and that God had given her a new heart, truly broken and sanctified. I could not then doubt of it, and have seen much in my acquaintance with her to confirm it. Though the work was glorious, yet I was filled with concern about the effect it might have upon others. I was ready to conclude, though too rashly, that some would be hardened by it in carelessness and looseness of life, and would take occasion from it to open their mouths in reproaches of religion. But the event was the reverse to a wonderful degree. God made it, I suppose, the greatest occasion of awakening to others of anything that ever came to pass in the town. I have had abundant opportunity to know the effect it had by my private conversation with many. The news of it seemed to be almost like a flash of lightning upon the hearts of young people all over the town and upon many others. Those persons amongst us who used to be farthest from seriousness, and that I most feared would make an ill improvement of it, seemed to be awakened with it. Many went to talk with her concerning what she had met with, and what appeared in her seemed to be to the satisfaction of all that did so. Presently upon this, a great and earnest concern about the great things of religion and the eternal world became universal in all parts of the town, and among persons of all degrees and all ages. The noise amongst the dry bones waxed louder and louder. All of the talk but about spiritual and eternal things was soon thrown by. All the conversation in all companies and upon all occasions was upon these things only, unless so much as was necessary for people carrying on their ordinary secular business. Other discourse than of the things of religion would scarcely be tolerated in any company. The minds of people were wonderfully taken off from the world. It was treated amongst us as a thing of very little consequence. They seemed to follow their worldly business more as a part of their duty than from any disposition they had to it. The temptation now seemed to lie on that hand, to neglect worldly affairs too much and to spend too much time in the immediate exercise of religion. This was exceedingly misrepresented by reports that were spread in distant parts of the land, as though the people here had wholly thrown by all worldly business, and betook themselves entirely to reading and praying and such like religious exercises. But although people did not ordinarily neglect their worldly business, yet religion was with all sorts a great concern, and the world was a thing only by the by. The only thing in their view was to get the kingdom of heaven, and everyone appeared pressing into it. The engagedness of their hearts in this great concern could not be hid. It appeared in the very countenances. It then was a dreadful thing amongst us to lie out of Christ, in danger every day of dropping into hell, and what persons' minds were intent upon was to escape for their lives and to fly from wrath to come. All would eagerly lay hold of opportunities for their souls, and were wont very often to meet together in private houses for religious purposes, and such meetings when appointed were greatly thronged. There was scarcely a single person in the town, old or young, left unconcerned about the great things of the eternal world. Those who were wont to be the vainest and loosest, and those who had been disposed to think and speak lightly of vital and experimental religion, were now generally subject to great awakenings, and the work of conversion was carried on in a most astonishing manner, and increased more and more. Souls did, as it were, come by flocks to Jesus Christ, From day to day, for many months together, might be seen evident instances of sinners brought out of darkness into the marvelous light, and delivered out of an horrible pit, and from the miry clay, and set upon a rock, with a new song of praise to God in their mouths. This work of God, as it was carried on, and the number of true saints multiplied, soon made a glorious alteration in the town, so that in the spring and summer following anno 1735, the town seemed to be full of the presence of God. It never was so full of love nor of joy, and yet so full of distress as it was then. There were remarkable tokens of God's presence in almost every house. It was a time of joy in families, on account of salvation being brought unto them. Parents rejoicing over their children as newborn, and husbands over their wives, and wives over their husbands. The goings of God were then seen in His sanctuary. God's day was a delight, and His tabernacles were amiable. Our public assemblies were then beautiful. The congregation was alive in God's service, everyone earnestly intent on the public worship, every hearer eager to drink in the words of the minister as they came from his mouth. The assembly in general were from time to time in tears while the word was preached, some weeping with sorrow and distress, others with joy and love, others with pity and concern for the souls of their neighbors. Our public praises were then greatly enlivened. God was then served in our psalmody, in some measure in the beauty of holiness. It has been observable that there has been scarce any part of divine worship wherein good men amongst us have had grace so drawn forth, and their hearts so lifted up in the ways of God, as in singing His praises. Our congregation excelled all that ever I knew in the external part of the duty before. The men generally carrying regularly and well 3 parts of music, and the women a part by themselves, but now they were evidently wont to sing with unusual elevation of heart and voice, which made the duty pleasant indeed. In all companies, on other days, on whatever occasions persons met together, Christ was to be heard of and seen in the midst of them. Our young people, when they met, were wont to spend the time in talking of the excellency and dying love of Jesus Christ, the glory of the way of salvation, the wonderful, free, and sovereign grace of God, His glorious work in the conversion of a soul, and certainty of the great things of God's Word, the sweetness of the views of His perfections, and so on. And even at weddings, which formerly were mere occasions of mirth and jollity, there was now no discourse of anything but religion, and no appearance of any but spiritual mirth. Those amongst us who had been formerly converted were greatly enlivened and renewed with fresh and extraordinary incomes of the Spirit of God, though some much more than others, according to the measure of the gift of Christ. Many who had before labored under difficulties about their own state had now their doubts removed by more satisfying experience and more clear discoveries of God's love. When this work first appeared and was so extraordinarily carried on amongst us in the winter, others round about us seemed not to know what to make of it. Many scoffed and ridiculed it, and some compared what we called conversion to certain distempers, but it was very observable of many, who occasionally came amongst us from abroad with disregardful hearts, that what they saw here cured them of such a temper of mind. Strangers were generally surprised to find things so much beyond what they had heard, and were wont to tell others that the state of the town could not be conceived of by those who had not seen it. The notice that was taken of it by the people who came to town on occasion of the court that sat here in the beginning of March was very observable, and those who came from the neighborhood to our public lectures were for the most part remarkably affected. Many who came to town on one occasion or other had their consciences smitten and awakened, and went home with wounded hearts, and with those impressions that never wore off till they had hopefully a saving issue. Those who before had serious thoughts had their awakenings and convictions greatly increased. There were many instances of persons who came from abroad on visits or on business who had not been long here, before to all appearances they were savingly wrought upon, and partook of that shower of divine blessing which God rained down here, and went home rejoicing till at length the same work began evidently to appear and prevail in several other towns in the country. In the month of March, the people in South Hadley begun to be seized with deep concern about the things of religion, which very soon became universal. The work of God has been very wonderful there, not much, if anything, short of what it has been here, in proportion to the size of the place. But at the same time it began to break forth in the west part of Suffield, where it also has been very great, and soon spread into all parts of the town. It appeared at Sunderland, and soon overspread the town, and I believe was for a season not less remarkable than it was here. About the same time it had began to appear in a part of Deerfield called Green River, and afterwards filled the town, and there has been a glorious work there. It began also to be manifested in the south part of Hatfield, in a place called the Hill, and the whole town in the second week in April seemed to be seized, as it were, at once, with concern about the things of religion, and the work of God has been great there. There has also been a very general awakening at West Springfield and Long Meadow, and in Enfield there was for a time a pretty general concern amongst some who before had been very loose persons. About the same time that this appeared in Enfield, the Reverend Mr. Bull of Westfield informed me that there had been a great alteration there, and that more had been done in 1 week than in 7 years before. Something of this work likewise appeared in the first precinct of Springfield, principally in the north and south extremes of the parish. And in Hadley Old Town there gradually appeared so much of a work of God on souls as at another time would have been thought worthy of much notice. For a short time there was also a very great and general concern of the like nature at Northfield, and wherever this concern appeared it seemed not to be in vain. But in every place God brought saving blessings with him, and his word attended with his spirit, as we have all reason to think, returned not void. It might well be said at that time in all parts of the country, "Who are these that fly as a cloud and as doves to their windows?" As what other towns heard of and found in this was a great means of awakening them, so our hearing of such a swift and extraordinary propagation and extent of this work did doubtless for a time serve to uphold the work amongst us. The continual news kept alive the talk of religion, and did greatly quicken and rejoice the hearts of God's people, and much awaken those who looked on themselves as still left behind, and made them the more earnest that they might share in the great blessing that others had obtained. This remarkable pouring out of the Spirit of God, which thus extended from one end to the other of this county, was not confined to it, but many places in Connecticut have partaken in the same mercy. For instance, the first parish at Windsor, under the pastoral care of the Reverend Mr. Marsh, was thus blessed about the same time as we at Northampton. While we had no knowledge of each other's circumstances, there has been a very great ingathering of souls to Christ in that place, and something considerable of the same work began afterwards in East Windsor, my honored father's parish, which was in times past been a place favored with mercies of this nature, above any on the western side of New England, excepting Northampton. There have been 4 or 5 seasons of the pouring out of the Spirit to the general awakening of the people there, since my father's settlement amongst them. There was also the last spring and summer a wonderful work of God carrying on at Coventry, under the ministry of the Reverend Mr. Macham. I had opportunity to converse with some Coventry people, who gave me a very remarkable account of the surprising change that appeared in the most rude and vicious persons there. The like was also very great at the same time in the part of Lebanon called the Crank, where the Reverend Mr. Wheelock, a young gentleman, is lately settled. And there has been much of the same at Durham, under the ministry of the Reverend Mr. Chauncey, and to appearance no small ingathering of souls there. Likewise, amongst many of the young people in the first precinct of Stratford, under the ministry of Reverend Mr. Gold, where the work was much promoted by the remarkable conversion of a young woman who had been a great company keeper as it was here. Something of this work appeared in several other towns in those parts, as I was informed when I was there last fall, and we have since been acquainted with something very remarkable of this nature at another parish in Stratford called Ripton, under the pastoral care of the Reverend Mr. Mills. There was a considerable revival of religion last summer at New Haven, Old Town, as I was once again informed by the Reverend Mr. Noyes, the minister there, and by others, and by a letter which I very lately received from Mr. Noyes, and also by information we have had other ways. The flourishing of religion still continues, and is lately much increased. Mr. Noyes writes that many this summer have been added to the church, and particularly mentions several young persons that belong to the principal families of that town. There has been a degree of the same work at a part of Guildford, and very considerable at Mansfield, under the ministry of Reverend Mr. Eleazar Williams, and an unusual religious concern at Toland, and something of it at Hebron and Bolton. There was also no small effusion of the Spirit of God in the North Parish at Preston, in the eastern part of Connecticut, of which I was informed and saw something when I was the last autumn at the house, and in the congregation of the Reverend Mr. Lord, the minister there, who, with the Reverend Mr. Owen of Groton, came up hither in May the last year on purpose to see the work of God, Having heard various and contradictory accounts of it, they were careful when here to satisfy themselves, and to that end particularly converse with many of our people, which they declare to be entirely to their satisfaction, and that one half had not been told them, nor could be told them. Mr. Lord told me that when he got home he informed his congregation of what he had seen, and that they were greatly affected with it, and that it proved the beginning of the same work amongst them, which prevailed till there was a general awakening, and many instances of persons who seemed to be remarkably converted. I also have lately heard that there has been something of the work at Woodbury, but this shower of divine blessing has been yet more extensive. There was no small degree of it in some part of the Jerseys, as I was informed when I was at New York, in a long journey I took at that time of the year for my health, by some people of the Jerseys whom I saw, especially the Reverend William Tennant, a minister who seemed to have such things at heart, told me of a very great awakening of many in a place called the Mountains, under the ministry of one Mr. Cross, and of a very considerable revival of religion in another place under the ministry of his brother, the Reverend Gilbert Tennant, and also at another place under the ministry of a very pious young gentleman, a Dutch minister, whose name, as I remember, was Freelinghouse. This seemed to have been a very extraordinary dispensation of providence. God has in many respects gone out of and much beyond his usual and ordinary way. The work in this town and others about us has been extraordinary on the account of the universality of it, affecting all sorts, sober and vicious, high and low, rich and poor, wise and unwise. It reached the most considerable families and persons, to all appearance as much as others. In former stories of this nature, the bulk of the young people have been greatly affected, but old men and little children have been so now. Many of the last have, of their own accord, formed themselves into religious societies in different parts of the town. A loose, careless person could scarcely be found in the whole neighborhood, and if there was anyone that seemed to remain senseless or unconcerned, it would be spoken of as a strange thing. This dispensation has also appeared very extraordinary in the numbers of those on whom we have reason to hope it has had a saving effect. We have about 620 communicants, which include almost all our adult persons. The church was very large before, but persons never thronged into it as they did in the late extraordinary time. Our sacraments are 8 weeks asunder, and I received into our communion about 100 before one sacrament, 80 of them at one time, whose appearance when they presented themselves together, make an open explicit profession of Christianity, was very affecting to the congregation. I took in near 60 before the next sacrament day, and I have very sufficient evidence of the conversion of their souls, through divine grace, though it is not the custom here, as it is in many other churches in this country, to make a credible relation of their inward experiences the ground of admission to the Lord's Supper. I am far from pretending to be able to determine how many have lately been the subjects of such mercy, but if I may be allowed to declare anything that appears to me probable in a thing of this nature, I hope that more than 300 souls were savingly brought home to Christ in this town, in the space of half a year, and about the same number of males as females. But what I have heard Mr. Stoddard say, this was far from what has been usual in years past, for he observed that in his time many more women were converted than men. Those of our young people who are on other accounts most considerable are mostly, as I hope, truly pious and leading persons in the way of religion. Those who were formerly loose young persons are generally, to all appearance, become true lovers of God and Christ, and spiritual in their dispositions. I hope that by far the greatest part of persons in this town above 60 years of age are such as have the saving knowledge of Jesus Christ. By what I have heard, I suppose it is so in some other places, particularly in Sunderland and South Hadley. This has also appeared to be a very extraordinary dispensation, that the Spirit of God is so much extended not only his awakening, but regenerating influences, both to elderly persons and also to those who are very young. It has been heretofore rarely heard of that any were converted past middle age, but now we have the same ground to think that many such have at this time been savingly changed, as that others have been so in more early years. I suppose there were upwards of 50 persons converted in this town above 40 years of age, more than 20 of them above 50, about 10 of them above 60, and 2 of them above 70 years of age. It has heretofore been looked on as a strange thing when any have seemed to be savingly wrought upon and remarkably changed in their childhood, but now I suppose near 30 were, to appearance savingly wrought upon between 10 and 14 years of age, 2 between 9 and 10, and 1 about 4 years of age. And because I suppose this last will be with most difficulty believed, I will hereafter give a particular account of it. The influences of God's Holy Spirit have also been very remarkable on children in some other places, particularly at Sunderland, South Hadley, and the west part of Suffield. There are several families in this town who are all hopefully pious. Yea, there are several numerous families in which I think we have reason to hope that all the children are truly godly, and most of them lately become so. There are very few houses in the whole town into which salvation has not lately come, in one or more instances. God has also seemed to have gone out of His usual way in the quickness of His work, and the swift progress His Spirit has made in His operation on the hearts of many. It is wonderful that persons should be so suddenly and yet so greatly changed. Many have been taken from a loose and careless way of living, and seized with strong convictions of their guilt and misery, and in a very little time old things have passed away and all things have become new with them. God's work has also appeared very extraordinary in the degrees of His influences, in the degrees both of awakening and conviction, and also of saving light, love, and joy that many have experienced. It has also been very extraordinary in the extent of it, and has been so swiftly propagated from town to town. In former times of the pouring out of the Spirit of God on this town, though on some of them it was very remarkable, it reached no further. The neighboring towns all around continued unmoved. This work seemed to be at its greatest height in this town in the former part of the spring in March and April. At that time God's work in the conversion of souls was carried on amongst us in so wonderful a manner that so far as I can judge it appears to have been at the rate of at least 4 persons in a day, or near 30 in a week, take one with another for 5 or 6 weeks together. When God in so remarkable a manner took the work into His own hands, there was as much done in a day or two as at ordinary times, when all endeavors that men can use, and with such a blessing as we commonly have, is done in a year. I am very sensible how apt many would be, if they should see the account I have here given, presently to think with themselves that I am very fond of making a great many converts, and of magnifying the manner, and to think that for want of judgment I take every religious pang and enthusiastic conceit for saving conversion. I do not much wonder if they should be apt to think so, and for this reason I have forborne to publish an account of this great work of God, though I have often been solicited. But having now a special call to give an account of it, upon mature consideration I thought it might not be beside my duty to declare this amazing work, as it appeared to me to be indeed divine, and to conceal no part of the glory of it, leaving it with God to take care of the credit of His own work, and running the venture of any censorious thoughts which might be entertained of me to my disadvantage, that distant persons may be under as great advantage as may be to judge for themselves of this matter. I would be a little more large in particular. Section 2. The manner of conversions, various, yet bearing in a great analogy. I therefore proceed to give an account of the manner of persons being wrought upon. And here there is a vast variety, perhaps as manifold as the subjects of the operation, but yet in many things there is a great analogy in all. Persons are first awakened with a sense of their miserable condition by nature, the danger they are in of perishing eternally, and that it is of great importance to them that they speedily escape and get into a better state. Those who before were secure and senseless are made sensible how much they were in the way to ruin in their former courses. Some are more suddenly seized with convictions, it may be by the news of others' conversion, or something they hear in public or in private conference. Their consciences are smitten, as if their hearts were pierced through with a dart. Others are awakened more gradually. They begin at first to be something more thoughtful and considerate, so as to come to a conclusion in their minds that it is their best and wisest way to delay no longer, but to improve the present opportunity. They have accordingly set themselves seriously to meditate on those things that have the most awakening tendency, on purpose to obtain convictions, and so their awakenings have increased, till a sense of their misery, by God's Holy Spirit setting in therewith, has had fast hold of them. Others, who before had been somewhat religious and concerned for their salvation, have been awakened in a new manner, and made sensible that their slack and dull way of seeking was never like to attain that purpose. These awakenings, when they have first seized on persons, have had 2 effects. One was that they have brought them immediately to quit their sinful practices, and the looser sort have been brought to forsake and dread their former vices and extravagances.
When once the Spirit of God began to be so wonderfully poured out in a general way through the town, people had soon done with their old quarrels, backbitings, and intermeddling with other men's matters. The tavern was soon left empty, and persons kept very much at home. None went abroad unless on necessary business, or on some religious account, and every day seemed in many respects like a Sabbath day. The other that it put them on earnest application to the means of salvation, reading, prayer, meditation, the ordinances of God's house, and private conference. Their cry was, "What shall we do to be saved?" The place of resort was now altered. It was no longer the tavern, but the minister's house, that would throng far more than ever the tavern had been wont to be. There is a very great variety as to the degree of fear and trouble that persons are exercised with before they attain any comfortable evidences of pardon and acceptance with God. Some are from the beginning carried on with abundantly more encouragement and hope than others. Some have had 10 times less trouble of mind than others, in whom yet the issue seems to be the same. Some have had such a sense of the displeasure of God and the great danger they were in of damnation that they could not sleep at nights, and many have said that when they have laid down, the thoughts of sleeping in such a condition have been frightful to them. They have scarcely been free from terror while asleep, and they have awakened with fear, heaviness, and distress still abiding on their spirits. It has been very common that the deep and fixed concern on persons' mind has had a painful influence on their bodies and given disturbance to animal nature. The awful apprehensions persons have had of their misery have for the most part been increasing the nearer they have approached to deliverance, though they often pass through many changes and alterations in the frame and circumstances of their minds. Sometimes they think themselves wholly senseless, and fear that the Spirit of God has left them, and that they are given up to judicial hardness. Yet they appear very deeply exercised about that fear, and are in great earnest to obtain convictions again. Together with those fears, and that exercise of mind which is rational, and which they have just ground for, they have often suffered many needless distresses of thought, in which Satan probably has had a great hand to entangle them, and block up their way. Sometimes the distemper of melancholy has been evidently mixed, of which when it happens, the tempter seems to take great advantage and puts an unhappy bar in the way of any good effect. One knows not how to deal with such persons. They turn everything that is said to them the wrong way, and most to their own disadvantage. There is nothing that the devil seems to make so great a handle of as a melancholy humor, unless it be the real corruption of the heart. But it is very remarkable that there has been far less of this mixture at this time of extraordinary blessing than there was wont to be in persons under awakenings at other times. For it is evident that many who before had been exceedingly involved in such difficulties seem now strangely to be set at liberty. Some persons who had before for a long time been exceedingly entangled with peculiar temptations of one sort or other, unprofitable and hurtful distresses, were soon helped over former stumbling blocks that hindered their progress towards saving good. Convictions have wrought more kindly, and they have been successfully carried on in the way to life. And thus Satan seemed to be restrained till towards the latter end of this wonderful time, when God's Holy Spirit was about to withdraw. Many times persons under great awakenings were concerned, because they thought they were not awakened, but miserable, hard-hearted, senseless, sottish creatures still, and sleeping upon the brink of hell. The sense of the need they have to be awakened, and of the comparative hardness grows upon them with their awakenings, so that they seem to themselves to be very senseless, when indeed most sensible. There have been some instances of persons who have had as great a sense of their danger and misery as their natures could well subsist under, so that a little more would probably have destroyed them, and yet they have expressed themselves much amazed at their own insensibility and sottishness at such an extraordinary time. Persons are sometimes brought to the borders of despair, and it looks as black as midnight to them a little before the day dawns in their souls. Some few instances there have been of persons who have had such a sense of God's wrath for sin that they have been overborne and made to cry out under an astonishing sense of their guilt, wondering that God suffers such guilty wretches to live upon earth, and that He does not immediately send them to hell. Sometimes their guilt doth so state them in the face that they are in exceeding terror for fear that God will instantly do it. But more commonly their distresses under legal awakenings have not been to such a degree. In some, these terrors do not seem to be so sharp. We're near comfort, as before. Their convictions have not seemed to work so much that way, but to be led further down into their own hearts, to a further sense of their own universal depravity and deadness in sin. The corruption of the heart has discovered itself in various exercises, in the time of legal convictions. Sometimes it appears in a great struggle, like something roused by an enemy, and Satan, the old inhabitant, seems to exert himself like a serpent disturbed and enraged. Many in such circumstances have felt a great spirit of envy towards the godly, especially towards those who are thought to have been lately converted, and most of all towards acquaintance and companions, when they are thought to be converted. Indeed, some have felt many heart risings against God, and murmurings at His way of dealing with mankind, and His dealing with themselves in particular. It has been much insisted on, both in public and private, that persons should have the utmost dread of such envious thoughts, which if allowed tend exceedingly to quench the Spirit of God, if not to provoke Him finally to forsake them.
This Reformation audio track is a production of Stillwater's Revival Books. SWRB makes thousands of classic Reformation resources available, free and for sale, in audio, video, and printed formats. Our many free resources, as well as our complete mail-order catalog, containing thousands of classic and contemporary Puritan and Reform books, tapes, and videos at great discounts, is on the web at www.swrb.com. We can also be reached by email at swrb@swrb.com, by phone at 780-450-3730, by fax at 780-468-1096, or by mail at 4710-37A Avenue, Edmonton, that's Edmonton, Alberta, abbreviated capital A, capital B, Canada, T6L3T5. You may also request a free printed catalog. And remember that John Calvin, in defending the Reformation's regulative principle of worship, or what is sometimes called the scriptural law of worship, commenting on the words of God, which I commanded them not, neither came into my heart, from his commentary on Jeremiah 7:31, writes, God here cuts off from men every occasion for making evasions, since He condemns by this one phrase, I have not commanded them, whatever the Jews devised. There is then no other argument needed to condemn superstitions than that they are not commanded by God. For when men allow themselves to worship God according to their own fancies, and attend not to His commands, they pervert true religion. And if this principle was adopted by the Papists, all those fictitious modes of worship in which they absurdly exercise themselves would fall to the ground. It is indeed a horrible thing for the Papists to seek to discharge their duties towards God by performing their own superstitions. There is an immense number of them, as it is well known, and as it manifestly appears. Were they to admit this principle, that we cannot rightly worship God except by obeying His word, they would be delivered from their deep abyss of error. The prophet's words, then, are very important, when he says that God had commanded no such thing, and that it never came to his mind, as though he had said that men assume too much wisdom when they devise what He never required, nay, what He never knew.